Jets fans are understandably frustrated with the state of the team right now, but it's not as hopeless as you think. It's really not, and I'll explain why today on Locked On Jets.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It's Wednesday, January 10th, 2024, and I'm your host, John B. from GangGreenNation.com. Thanking you so much for making the show your first listen or first watch every day. Subscribe to the show for free on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts so you'll get new episodes as soon as they're posted. If you enjoy the show and are listening on a podcast source, give it a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube, give this episode a big thumbs up. It helps us out, helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Today's episode is brought to you by Jase Medical. Empower yourself when you purchase a Jase case, providing you with a personal supply of 5 antibiotics that treat 50-plus infections. Get yours today at jasemedical.com and use code LOCKEDON to get $20 off your order. That's JASE medical.com. Well, today we have our weekly mailbag show. Each Wednesday we do a mailbag show with listener questions. Thanks to everybody who sent in questions. Our first question comes from Vincent. Vincent's a big Jets fan, and like many of you, he is not a happy camper with the state of the team. Vincent wrote to me, "Hey, John, love the show. It's helped me deal with the Jets' craziness through the years." Well, thanks, Vincent. That's very nice of you. Vincent continues, "Monday, I was captivated by the exit interviews with the coaches, players, and GM. And my God, I could not have been more disappointed and assured that the Jets will not be turning it around next year. To start with, Saleh was completely delusional. He claimed the team got better through the year. He claimed that they are getting better every year and they are close. But what's the evidence? In fact, the Jets scored less points and gave up more points this year compared with 2022. Additionally, the Jets can continue the 3-year trend under him of getting worse after the bye week. Saleh even said his offensive line coach did a good job, which is not surprising since it's a friend of his. Am I wrong to have no faith that Saleh will come back to reality and actually critically evaluate his coaching style?" The players were pretty scathing on this coaching staff as well, beginning with Rodgers' statement on getting the BS out of the way. Then Garrett Wilson all but threw the offensive coaching under the bus. And to be honest, his statement sounded like a player who will not be here in 2 years when Rodgers is gone. So should I not buy that jersey? Then the GM, who I blame the whole year on. He gives us the typical lines of talk from him, but there's no real evidence in changes to his evaluation system that led us to Zach Wilson, Becton over Wirfs, the signings of Khalil, Hardman, Lazard, and Tomlinson, the restructuring of Lawson, then not playing him, the selection of McDonald over players of positions of needs, and so on. I don't think the beat properly held his feet to the fire over the significant flaws with this team now and moving into next year. Aside from Rodgers coming back, am I wrong to be totally pessimistic that the Jets will realize their faults and address them properly to make themselves a true contender in the AFC? So Vincent, you can tell, is not happy, and I think Vincent probably shares sentiments with a lot of the listeners out there. I think the frustrating thing for me is that the Jets really aren't that far away from being a pretty good team. You know, we've got some young talent here, and that, to me, that's the big difference from this team from where it was 4 or 5 years ago. You know, there was no Sauce Gardner, there was no Garrett Wilson, there was no Breece Hall, and even some of the second-tier guys like a Michael Carter II, and then they didn't really have that base of talent. A couple of years ago, really all they had were Jamal Adams and Marcus May, and those were two guys who played safety. And with all due respect to them and all due respect to the safety position, safeties don't really move the needle in the NFL. There's a pretty good base of young talent in this team. And here's the other thing in the NFL. You're never really as far away as you think you are. I remember after the 2020 season, people acted like the Philadelphia Eagles were doomed. They said that's the worst situation in the NFL. Well, 2 years later, they were in the Super Bowl. They almost won the Super Bowl. And I know this year they've had a bit of a rough finish, but yeah, that team went from being like in the middle of nowhere to almost winning the championship within 2 years. I mean, a year ago this time, the Houston Texans seemed like the most lost organization in the NFL. They were kind of in the wilderness. So, I'm not particularly optimistic about the guys running the team, and I tend to agree with Vincent that what we heard on Monday was not particularly encouraging from Saleh. And in fact, not changing anything on the offensive coaching staff. I mentioned it on yesterday's show that the coaching staff in 2022 on the offensive side of the ball got fired for less. They did a better job than the Jets did in 2023, and they still got fired. I can understand the frustration. I can understand the degree of pessimism Vincent has, but you have to remember, you're never really that far away in the NFL. Like, the Jets, That, like, maybe this is one of the things that's frustrating. If the Jets would just kind of chill out for a year, like this team with Rodgers coming back, who knows? Maybe they can make the run to the playoffs. Maybe they could get in, and once you get in, anything can happen. I think the problem with the Jets right now, and this is something that's got to change, is they got to get off this idea that, like, they have this short window where Rodgers is going to carry the team, and then we don't worry about what happens after that. They have to find more balance. I think next year the goal should be, let's get to the playoffs instead of like this whole let's load up for trying to make a Super Bowl run with Rodgers. I don't think that's realistic, but can the Jets be one of the top 7 teams in the conference next year? Absolutely. And I feel like if that happens, the team will have a completely different feel. And I feel like part of what the goal with Rodgers should not be to try and like pump this team up to win for one run and then just disregard what happens after it. What the Jets should be trying to do is change their reputation across the league. Because right now, the Jets don't really have a very good reputation. If you like go to the playoffs next year with Rodgers and you have this iconic player, going across telling people, this was a good experience for me, even if he retires at the end of next year, it's going to change a lot of perceptions across the league. So to me, like, that's what the focus should be. And like, they're not that far away. It's not like a totally hopeless situation like it was in 2019 with Adam Gase in 2020. Now, I don't look, I guess I fall somewhere between, feeling really good about the team. Like a lot of people think just if you bring Rodgers back, suddenly you're a Super Bowl contender. I don't buy that. I don't think all is lost, though. I do think you've got like a really promising young core right here. And if you just like, they're not that far away. Like, just make a couple smart decisions, value your draft picks, have a smart offseason with your cap. It's within your grasp. Just do that and we'll be in pretty good shape. Doug, I think Vincent's right. Douglas has not done a good job. Salah's not done a good job. I understand. I think after a season like this, after a 13-year stretch like this, it's understandable you're frustrated. I know, like, I sound like a broken record. I know people will say, John, you always say this. When's it going to happen? But at some point, the Jets are going to be good again. At some point, the Jets will just like fall into like a good season. I know I've been saying this since the podcast began in 2016, and it hasn't happened yet, but it is going to happen. And it's really hard to stay this bad for this long. And at some point, it's just going to work for the Jets, I promise. Next question. John, why do I feel the dread that Dalvin Cook's going to produce in the playoffs for the Ravens and make the Jets look even worse? Well, Jets fans are not in a good mood. That's a great question. I would actually not be surprised if Dalvin Cook strung together a couple decent games. Now, I wouldn't be surprised if he went out and played terrible for Baltimore because I think he's pretty much finished. But, there's always the old guy can always like find rejuvenation for a game or two. There's always like a good game or two in any guy who used to be a quality player. And I think, getting to Baltimore, change of scenery, being a little fired up for the playoffs, in a good offense and a good system and a good scheme that'll open up opportunities, especially opportunities in the run game. I could see Dalvin Cook playing well. The thing with Baltimore is like, Baltimore got Dalvin Cook at like the point you should get him. They got him while his value was low, and they say, we're going to test this guy out. If he's got anything, great. If not, we haven't invested anything in him. The Jets bought high, and that ultimately, in retrospect, was the mistake, I think, for the Jets. They bought high and they gave him this big role. Baltimore's bringing him in, and they maybe test him out for a couple carries, and if he has the hot hand, maybe they'll stick with him. If not, then nothing lost. So, but ultimately, look, this was a failed signing for the Jets. Dalvin Cook's at the end of his career. And I'm not going to panic over like Dalvin Cook having a couple nice carries because at the end of the day, he got plenty of opportunities with the Jets. And, I think it's something like his longest play from scrimmage this year wouldn't even be in Breece Hall's top 30. So, you can't panic over things like that. I don't think it makes the Jets necessarily look bad. I think if Cook shows he has anything left in the tank, I'm not totally convinced he's going to do that, but I think it would make Baltimore look good. I think what made the Jets look bad was giving him that much money when, he was really at the end of his career. Now, ahead here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we're going to turn our attention to another favorite topic of Jets fans, man. Everybody's in a bad mood this week. We're going to turn our attention to the owner, Woody Johnson. Is it possible the NFL could actually intervene with Woody? It's actually got some precedent. You may be surprised to learn that. I'll tell you what that is as we continue on this Wednesday edition of the Locked On Jets podcast. This episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by Jase Medical. I know we come to sports to escape from some of the crazy realities of real life, but can we talk for a minute about preparing for real life? According to the FDA, pharmacies are running out of antibiotics like amoxicillin right in the middle of the worst flu season in over a decade. And it must be a helpless feeling if someone you care about got sick while a supply chain issue kept them from getting the life-saving medication they needed. Thankfully, because of Jase Medical, you can be okay. The Jase case is a pack of 5 different antibiotics to treat a long list of bacterial illnesses, including UTIs, respiratory infections, skin infections, among others. This stuff can happen to any of us. Visit jasemedical.com and complete your physician encounter. It will be reviewed by a board-certified physician, and your medications will be dispensed by a licensed pharmacy at a fraction of the regular cost. It's never been more important to be prepared than today. Go to jasemedical.com and use offer code LOCKEDON to get $20 off your first order. Again, it's Jase Medical, Jase medical.com. Offer code LOCKEDON is one word with no space, LOCKEDON, to get $20 off your first order. This episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by PrizePicks. You know, PrizePicks is the largest daily fantasy sports platform in North America. It's the easiest and most exciting way to play DFS. It's just you against the numbers. Instead of battling thousands of other players, including pros and sharks, you pick more or less than on 2 to 6 player stat projections, and you watch the winnings roll in. You can test your skills on PrizePicks this football season. It is the most exciting way to play daily fantasy sports. If you have the skills, you can turn $10 into $250 with just a few taps. PrizePicks is really simple to play. You can submit your entry in less than 60 seconds. Quick withdrawals, easy gameplay, and an enormous selection of players and stat types are what make PrizePicks the #1 daily fantasy sports app. Go to prizepicks.com/LockedOnNFL and use code LockedOnNFL for a first deposit match. Again, it's prizepicks.com/LockedOnNFL and use code LockedOnNFL. It's one word with no space, LOCKEDONNFL, for a first deposit match of up to $100 using PrizePicks. Thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listen or first watch every day. And a big shout out to you everydayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets. We have new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday, and then bonus episodes as needed. We continue. Our next question is from Drew. Drew writes, "Hi, John. I totally despise Woody Johnson. At best, he's a meddling nincompoop, and at worst, he does not care how the team does as long as he makes money. Do you think there's any chance the NFL tells him to get his act together at some point, or is this just wishful thinking at my part? I firmly believe we are never winning the Super Bowl with him as the owner." So as you can tell, Jets fans not really thrilled. At least the people submitting the questions to me are not thrilled. If you're a happy Jets fan, please submit your questions next week to the mailbag. I think we need a little bit more positivity in our questions. Could the NFL intervene with Woody Johnson? I don't think they're going to make him sell the team, but there actually is precedent for something like this happening. In the late 1970s, the New York Giants, the team across town, was just a disaster. And the biggest issue was they had dysfunctional ownership. They had 2 owners. They had Wellington Mara. It was actually a very legendary figure in NFL circles now. And part of the reason he's legendary is that the Giants figured this thing out and the league got involved. He was constantly bickering with his nephew. And Pete Rozelle, the commissioner, essentially stepped in at one point and said, "You know what? This executive George Young from Miami, you got to bring him in, hire him." And George Young came in and turned the Giants around. The Giants eventually hired a guy, Ray Perkins, as their head coach, who left after a short tenure. But in this one of the assistants Perkins hires was promoted to head coach after he left. Perkins got the head coaching job at the University of Alabama. And when he left, one of his assistants, Bill Parcells, took over the Giants. Young and Parcells combined for 2 Super Bowls. And the Giants, it's very difficult to imagine this, but the Giants actually had people signing airplanes to fly banners over their games. We've heard that a lot with the Jets through the years about the air. We've seen this multiple times. Somebody hire an airplane to fly a banner expressing frustration with the Jets. Well, that was happening to the Giants in the late 70s. The league stepped in. Would the league step in again and make advice to give Woody Johnson advice? I mean, I don't know, but one thing that people kind of miss on this stuff, because everybody, I think this is true across the NFL. People think the league's out to get their team. They think there's some conspiracy, the league's out to get you, and sometimes blown calls because the league's out to get you, or other things that happen across the league. Look, I'm not saying the Jets never have blown calls. Jets actually had quite a few blown calls go against them this year. Officiating really did hurt the Jets this year, but the league has every incentive to help the team in its #1 market succeed. And I don't know, would they eventually step in and say, they can't, I don't think they'd tell Woody, you're going to have to sell the team. But I do think it's possible that they'd look at the situation and say, Woody, maybe this is what you should do, because we don't want the Jets to keep being bad. I think it's conceivable. Now, would Woody listen? I don't know. I mean, the other thing with Woody is I do think he cares. I think some people believe he just cares about making money. I think he cares. I think the problem with Woody is he views relevancy and he views winning the offseason as the path to winning the Super Bowl. And that's not always the case. In fact, it's more often than not, it's not the case. More often, it's the teams that don't make the headlines for the splashy moves in the offseason that end up really improving their team in the offseason, because like sometimes the under the radar moves, the guy you get who nobody is expecting to be good, but you've done a great scouting job and you found a hidden gem. That's how you end up being good. Drafting well, nobody's ever excited about the third, fourth round pick, but if you scout really well and you get a great player, that really helps your team. These are the things the Jets need to focus on over winning the offseason. Now, again, there is precedent for the league did this of decades ago. Would they do it again? Well, they do have every incentive to like try again. Jets are number one market in the league. It's good for the leagues when the New York teams are good. So, I think it's conceivable. Would he listen? I don't know. Next question. You can cut one Jet, disregard cap hits. Who is it and why? This one, sometimes I have to think a lot about these questions. This one was easy. Allen Lazard. This guy is one of my least favorite players. I mean, he just brings nothing to the table. I guess like disregarding the cap hit, actually, I guess, well, this year if you cut him, there's a lot of dead money, but like he's got a huge cap hit, which is part of the reason I cut him. But he's a big receiver who like doesn't play big, so like, he doesn't run good routes, he doesn't separate. But a guy his size, you're not really necessarily expecting that. The bigger guys tend to be plotters. They tend to really not have a lot of speed, and because they're bigger, they can't make cuts as sharp because it kind of takes a little while to get their momentum going. But usually what they lack in, speed and quickness and route running, they make up for in size, where you just throw them the ball, they're like a human passing lane. Just throw them the ball, he'll outfight somebody for it. Lazard never outfights anybody. Lazard's got to be the softest, like big-bodied receiver I've ever seen. I shouldn't say that because I've seen Stephen Hill, but like he's in that category where he doesn't win contested catches. A guy that size to play as small as he does, it's so frustrating to me. And I remember last year when the Jets signed him, and I think like part of it's some people will just like tell you any offseason move the Jets make is good. And that's the only thing I can figure out why people thought Lazard would be a good signing. Because look, his stats were bad in Green Bay. And it's not like you could say he's going to play better now that he's got Aaron Rodgers as his quarterback. He had Aaron Rodgers his whole career in Green Bay. Beyond that, I actually like watched the film on some of his games, and when I watched the film, I saw the same thing. I saw he was just like he couldn't separate. Again, not surprising. He didn't have a lot of speed. Not surprising. Not a great route runner. Not surprising. But what surprised me is like how soft he was. He never fought for the ball. That's just not good. I remember thinking like this is a guy the Jets fans are. Jets fans haven't really watched this guy. That's why they're praising him. Jets fans are going to love to hate this guy, and I hate to be right about that. I wish he went out there and proved me wrong, but unfortunately, he did not. Now, ahead here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll talk about a guy who I have more hope for, Elijah Vera Tucker. Robert Saleh made some headlines with some comments he made about Vera Tucker, how the Jets may handle him going forward. And we'll talk about how they might be able to avoid injuries as we continue on this Wednesday edition of the Locked On Jets podcast. This show is sponsored by BetterHelp. Around New Year, we get obsessed with how to change ourselves instead of expanding on what we're already doing right. Maybe you finally organize one part of your space and you want to tackle another, or maybe you're taking your supplements every morning and now you want to actually eat breakfast too. Therapy helps you find your strengths so you can ditch the extreme resolutions and make changes that really stick. Therapy has so many benefits. It's helpful for learning positive coping skills, how to set boundaries. It empowers you to be the best version of yourself. And it's not just for those who've experienced major trauma. And if you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online, designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. Just fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with a licensed therapist and switch therapists at any time for no additional charge. Celebrate the progress you've already made. Visit BetterHelp.com/lockedon today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/lockedon. Again, BetterHelp. This is the Locked On Jets podcast here on this Wednesday. We're doing our weekly mailbag show. Our next question, John, in a recent podcast, you discussed Saleh's comments suggesting that perhaps AVT changing positions so often contributed to his injuries. I would take this one step further and say specifically playing offensive tackle is what injured AVT. He has short arms, so he's getting out leveraged. His season-ending injuries have always occurred after he made the change to full-time offensive tackle. Do you have any thoughts on this? I couldn't tell you. I think that's what Saleh's kind of getting at. That's my guess. I mean, it's difficult to say. I mean, did that happen? Did those injuries happen because of the plays that he was, trying to execute a tackle? It's really tough to say. Saleh and the Jets certainly seem to think so. So I think like that's actually like the theory the Jets are going with. For me, like I can't speak medically about it. So my mindset is just, they've moved him around so much. And I understand guys in the NFL change positions relatively frequently. I understand that, it's not necessarily the biggest deal, but I just like to see them stick him in one spot and keep him there. And I feel like I kind of laid out on yesterday's show the case for tackle and the case for guard. The case for tackle is essentially that it's hard to find a tackle in the NFL. So if a guy can play both positions, tackle is probably where you should stick because tackle is kind of the higher value position because of the scarcity. But I think like guard might be the spot for him. As you mentioned, like, there's an injury, maybe there is a risk of him being out leveraged because he has shorter arms. And I think like that's where the Jets originally planned to stick him. So I kind of lean toward playing guard, and also coming off an Achilles injury, I think you don't want to put as much stress on him. And playing tackle is tougher because you have to protect the edge. You're playing inside. If there are any lingering effects to that Achilles injury, they're not going to be as big of a deal because he's not going to have to. You'll have a guy on each side of him, so he won't need to protect as wide of a space. He won't need to kick out. You won't need to get out with agility as quite as far. So I kind of lean towards him playing guard. Whether that's a medical thing, difficult to say. And our last question, John. I think in an ideal world, the Jets make Bryce Huff a priority this offseason. Realistically, he's a premier pass rusher, and he's going to cost a lot of money. We've invested a lot of resources in pass rushers recently, and Salah rotates linemen frequently. Do you think the Jets should invest that much money into Huff, or delegate the money to adding talent to the offense? To me, like, this is like one of the things when I say like the Jets are so backwards as an organization, this is one of the things like I would look to. Right, this is a player who had double-digit sacks, 10 sacks. He played less than half the snaps this season, and he's 25 years old. Like, there's no context where trying to keep this guy, where you do anything other than try and keep this guy. Like, sometimes we overcomplicate things. Yes, the Jets should focus on the offense this offseason, but that doesn't mean that, like, at the expense of letting a premium 25-year-old pass rusher walk out the door. I think that the move that you probably make if you're tight on money is you look to trade John Franklin Myers, who kind of had a down year and is kind of reaching the age where you wonder whether he's at the end of his prime, and you keep the guy who's in his prime and use the money that you save to keep Huff around. Because I'm assuming that if you're letting Huff go, you're keeping JFM around. Well, you always should try and trade guys a year before, right around the time their prime's ending. JFM's, late 20s. He's approaching 30. So I know he kind of plays a different role because he's more of a power end, whereas Huff's just like a pure edge rusher who gets after the quarterback. But I don't see any rationale for not trying to keep Huff. And here's the other thing I'm going to say, because I already see this coming. There's a price where a player doesn't make sense for a team. And Huff, now the Jets have really put themselves behind the 8 ball here. And this is the point I'm going to make, is like the first day of free agency, Huff may get a huge contract from somebody else. And people will say, well, good job by the Jets. They couldn't afford Huff. They got to focus on the offense. It's too much money for a pass rusher. Yeah, the Jets deserve no praise at all if that situation plays out, because they had every opportunity to lock Huff up before he hit free agency. Was I or was I not saying a year ago that was the perfect time to extend Huff? And look, I'd be lying to you if I thought Huff was going to have 10 sacks this year. But a year ago, I said it on the show multiple times that he was at a point of his career. He was a year away from free agency. He had made nothing. In the NFL, it's always risky to wait another year because you could suffer an injury that affects your trajectory. So it's always in your incentive to try and get paid when you can, even if you leave a little money on the table. The Jets could have had a Huff on a bargain deal a year ago. I mean, I know there's always the possibility some guys will say, I'm playing out my contract here. I don't think Huff would have done it. That's just an educated guess because, again, he'd made no money and he was one injury away from never being able to earn in this league. So I think he probably would have left a lot of money on the table. And this was at a point where he was a situational pass rusher. Jets would have one of the best contracts in football if they had done this a year ago. I mean, it doesn't really matter what they gave him because it wouldn't have been as much as he provided this season. I think that this was a misstep by the Jets. And even during the season, I think they had opportunities. I think the problem with Huff is that they just completely misread the situation. Why did they bring Lawson back this year? They're going to have Lawson's going to count $6 million against the cap next year when he's not on the team. And they just could have cut him last year and saved 8 figures in cap space. They brought him back. They restructured that deal and they pushed dead money to the future to bring Lawson back because they didn't think Huff was good enough. Why did they draft Will McDonald? I think in part because they didn't know what they had enough. I think they completely missed this internal evaluation. And that's one of the reasons they're in such a tough spot. But look, am I buying the idea that bringing Huff back is going to preclude you from improving your wide receiver room or your offensive line room. No, I don't buy that at all, because the Jets have done nothing but create extra cap space the last year. The Jets have not really shown themselves to, really care that much about fiscal prudence. And fiscal prudence is figuring out a way to keep a 25-year-old pass rusher. You can always make room for one guy who's a priority guy for you without completely disrupting your team. To me, this just makes too much sense. I will be very, very upset if Bryce Huff is not a member of the New York Jets in 2024. I'm just laying it out there right now. This is not the type of thing that should prevent the Jets from getting a good receiver. It should not prevent them from upgrading their offensive line. 25-year-old pass rusher, 10 sacks, less than half the snaps. Common sense. Keep him. Anyway, that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoy the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you enjoy the show and are listening on a podcast source, give it a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube, give this episode a big thumbs up. It helps us out, helps other Jets fans find the show. Hope you have a great Wednesday, everybody. We'll be back tomorrow to talk more Jets.